Please welcome your panelists for Power Plant Exploring the Cannabis Industry, moderated by Managing Partner of Casa Verde Capital, Karan Wadhera.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. The theme, as you all know, for this year's Milken Global Conference is Navigating a World in Transition. So, I think this couldn't be more apt for our discussion today on the cannabis industry. Entrepreneurs and investors alike are eager to understand how to navigate this space. And there's a new economy, there's a massive cultural and political transition happening, and that's not just taking place here in the US, but it's taking place globally. So I think this is going to be a very exciting discussion. Before I get started speaking with my panelists, I did want to go through a very quick overview of the industry just to get everyone on the basic same page. Obviously, I could spend just an hour doing that, but we'll try to keep it quick. So maybe we could start with the first slide. Great. So here are just some very big numbers for you to understand the overview. $75 billion industry by 2030. The 5-year outlook, according to some folks, is $35 billion, which assumes every state will have some level of implementation here in the US. 64%, that is the acceptance, the push for legalization from the United States and citizens here. Gallup has been tracking this poll for over 30 years. It's the highest it's ever been. The US is clearly ready for legalization. $1 billion, that's the expected tax revenue this year from California. 283,000 jobs will come into the space over the course of the next few years. And we now have 40-plus countries with some level of legality, decriminalization, or a medical program in place. So it's pretty impressive. Next slide. So today, we really want to focus on the technology behind this industry, because I think that's a topic that people don't really focus on enough. And it's one that's incredibly important, both from a consumer standpoint and also from an investment standpoint. So the way we look at the space is there's a plant-touching industry, and that involves cultivation, retail, manufacturing, et cetera. And then there's an ancillary industry, which is there to support the space: e-commerce, financial services, media, compliance, et cetera. So just to level set how we look at this space. Next. This is a really simple graphic to show you what the U.S. industry looks like. We're now in 9 states plus D.C., where we have an adult use program, 30 in total if you count medical, and then some states with CBD, and you'll see just a very small portion of the U.S. now where there's no regulation or rules in place. Next. This is the global landscape. Again, similar. The dark blue and yellow gives you an idea of where we have some level of legality and decriminalization around the world. You can see it's a pretty large chunk of the planet. Next. And then there's just been some major events this year that everyone should be aware of, which we think is going to move the push of legalization much quicker than expected. So California, for one, at the beginning of this year, became an adult use state. Vermont legalized adult use cannabis through legislation, not the typical voting at the ballot box. Cronos Group, a Canadian cannabis company listed on the NASDAQ, so first major cannabis company listed on a major exchange here in the U.S. Trump has shifted his tune and has made a commitment to the Colorado senator that the federal government won't be infringing on states' rights. The former House Speaker, John Boehner, joined a board of a multi-state operator recently. And then also you're now starting to see large institutions coming into the space. Tiger Global recently led an investment in an ancillary cannabis company. So that's just, like I said, we could spend a long time going into the news in this space and what's been happening politically, but that would take the entire session. So I want to now, as I sort of alluded to earlier, really focus on the technology in this industry and the role it's playing. And then as we move on, we'll get into some of the more general discussions of the industry. So I'd like to start with Ben Kovler here on my right. Ben operates cultivations and retail businesses in 5 states. I can imagine that's incredibly challenging and filled with a lot of nuance. Can you tell us about how difficult it is to operate such a business? And then also, what role has technology played in helping to alleviate some of those headaches?
So great. Thanks, Karen. Thanks, everybody at the Milken Institute. It's great to see a room packed on day 3 of the conference, and they've upgraded the size of the room in the 3rd or 4th year of the panel. So the interest level is high. We are likely at an inflection point in the industry. And just to set the stage, I think that's an awesome overview of the industry, $75 billion, a number everybody should think about. I'll give you 1 minute on the lens by which I come to the space and how we've set up our business. And Karen's right, we're a national U.S. cannabis operator. But at the core, what drives this is super complicated. It's federally illegal, and there's a lot of hurdles. But we try to keep it pretty simple. So at the core to our thesis is we don't think history repeats itself. We think history rhymes. And we've seen this movie before, and this is Prohibition 2.0. And driving our thesis are brands distributed at scale is going to be the way to win. And those brands are distributed in the Prohibition 2.0 analogy. The booze, the brands of booze, are distributed through bars. And we also own a national chain of bars called Rise Dispensaries, in which we're serving customers and patients throughout the country. So that lens is by which I look through, and it's a tightly regulated industry in 50 different markets with 50 different supply-demand economies and different kinds of players and different sorts of things. So technology is our friend, and technology is way behind. And so for the investors, there is monstrous opportunity to add value into this space because you're in a very finite moment in time in which the capital, and you heard the introduction from Mike, and really what drives this whole thing is capital. There's a restriction on capital in the cannabis business because it is federally illegal. And so for this period of time, that gives me the opportunity to build large market share, drive down cost of capital, and then I'm going to be in a position to compete with the multinationals who cannot invest here. So whether it's SAP, Oracle, Microsoft, et cetera, they're figuring out ways to do it. But the technology we're dealing with, except for the folks on the stage here, is essentially a Windows 98-esque platform, right, in an Amazon world. And so we're hampered. There's no capital here. The opportunity is massive. As sophistication comes here, as the walls come down, there'll be tons of opportunity. And so I think that's an overall lens by which I look. But simple things. We're running a national chain of stores. You would think I could get a dashboard of every store's sales by day at the end of the day. Like, no. There's no program that can do that because in Nevada, it's a different program as Illinois, different program than Maryland, different program than Pennsylvania, different than Massachusetts. And some people are starting to get scale, and you're going to hear about that. And scale is the way to win. That's going to drive down the cost of capital. Lowest cost of capital wins. We're in the institute of that. And so we believe that. That's what drives our business decisions, and we need a lot more out of the technology, and so we're excited as investment and innovation hits the space.
So, Mike, you've been a technology-focused investor for the past 2 decades. You've been behind some incredible winners, YouTube, StemCentrix, et cetera. How are you viewing the cannabis landscape, and talk to me specifically through the lens of technology where you think there are opportunities and how you're deploying capital?
All right, thanks. And thanks again, everybody. This is exciting to be here and see a full room and to see this start to take off more mainstream. As Karan said, we've been in the technology investing space for about 20 years in San Francisco, and had the benefit of coming at that space from the industry, from working in the semiconductor and the silicon industry, and seeing the evolution of cell phones and other problems, or solving other problems with technology, but always through the lens of an operator. And so if you look back at technology, some of the exciting things that we have today, the big 30, 40, $100 billion companies, Salesforce.com, Workflow, all these guys, they're really not that complicated at the end of the day. It's a database in the sky, or it's this. Even Netflix and some of the other things are built on the back of some of the comm infrastructure and platforms that we put together 20, 30, 50, 100 years ago. And what's happening now in cannabis, and the way we look at our investing lens to invest in cannabis, is from that same operator's landscape. So many, and we've been investing in cannabis for about 3 years years now. So many of the deals you see, et cetera, are things that are there to enhance a business that hasn't yet scaled. And so we took the approach to actually own and operate more as a private equity firm, some of the early parts of the chain, dispensary, grow, et cetera, so that when we actually make our venture investment dollars, we do it through the lens of an operator. And so what we're finding, just like in technology, a lot of the early solutions are just very simple things that you already have in other industries. You have them in the financial industry, or you have them, there's all different types of CRM systems. There are multi-billion-dollar CRM companies that are just for the pharma industry, and on and on and on. And so it's very exciting to see that happening in cannabis. But sometimes when you look under the covers, it's still very early. Some of the applications and the technology pieces are things that are there to correct a very small minutia. So it's hard to figure out what kind of capital you want to put in when it's literally a technology that takes this database and moves it over here. But something as simple as printing out an invoice right now, it can be quite complicated, especially when your business is growing 30, 40% month over month. The ability to go in and have, or when you're putting something into the state database system, which I think we'll talk about later, if you make a mistake, well, that could cost you hours. So to be at the forefront of an industry like that, where some of the big technology applications aren't necessarily game-changing things, but they can really change your business right now. So that's the lens we look at it through, and we're finding some interesting things, but a lot of it is very small and nuanced.
So, I want to stress this point because, I'm not sure if everyone here understands the level of complexity of what you have to do when you're operators here. And a lot of that flows back into a state compliance system. So when you're talking about cultivation, or you're talking about manufacturing, or you're talking about distribution, or you're talking about retail, every data point on a daily basis in most regulated states has to be reported back into a central system. So you can imagine, sometimes how burdensome that can be, and technology is obviously playing a role in helping to alleviate that. So we're really lucky to have Jeff Wells from Metric on the panel. This is the first time he's ever joined anything like this. So he's doing it at the Milken Institute, which I think obviously speaks very highly of what's happening here. And Jeff, your system is in the majority of legal states here, and you're actually have built the platform which is collecting all this data for the states. Tell us why this is important. Why is there so much sort of complexity involved? Why are they tracking so much information? And why will this eventually make the industry succeed further in the future?
Well, thanks, Karan. This is the first time I've spoken publicly about our business and our system, primarily because we work specifically with the regulators, and we chose very early on in this opportunity to not actually build anything for the industry. So our system has been built in partnership with the regulators. So what's interesting for us is we're a technology development company. We have a long history in the supply chain, and we've worked with other types of supply chain, such as food. So we've engaged with the FDA and the USDA. And what's interesting to us, and what's happened with cannabis, is we've had a long history of what the challenges of the FDA in recalls and the data that they have that's actionable data. And we saw that firsthand for decades. And when we were fortunate enough to win a contract back in 2011 with Colorado, we took a lot of that knowledge and we were able to help the regulators navigate what they were about to endeavor on. And it was interesting, they were able to go much further, in our opinion, than the FDA has ever been able to do in the fact that it's federally illegal, and seems like the legislature has in almost every state taken the approach that they would require a lot of those regulators as far as collecting data. And that's where we came up with the track and trace systems, the seed to sale systems, and so forth. And that's the contract that we won. So when we looked at it, we said, well, this is a wonderful opportunity to help the regulators build a reporting system that kind of is what we've been studying for decades, that the USDA and the FDA would like to have, or the data they would like to have, especially when there's a recall. So we helped them navigate that, and it was interesting from the standpoint that they were able, and it was not easy, but they were able to use some of our technology and be able to navigate that in a way that has been efficient and cost effective, and they've been able to have a system that they're actually proactively they're actually regulating on a basis of data driven, and that's a term that's being thrown around in academia around cannabis. But this data driven idea of regulation, they're actually doing that proactively. So it's ironic to us that cannabis has been able to navigate those waters, because with the FDA and USDA, there's a lot of politics, and there's a lot of reasons why they've not been able to get as far with being able to collect the kind of data that these regulators are being able to collect at the state level. One other thing that's interesting that a lot of times is missed when we start talking about the regulatory side, or what the regulators actually have to do in these states, is that they've actually taken on something that's really back to the first time we had prohibition. They're dealing with a federally illegal substance, and every state government depends on the federal government for certain activities. So the FDA and the USDA are missing, the EPA is missing. So when they start down the path to regulate this market, they have to fill in those gaps. And that's very, very interesting. The state regulators have actually beginning to do a very good job of that, which is, in our opinion, gotten the attention to a certain degree of the federal government. We see what's happening with some of the political figures there, and I think it will help show the way, and there's an opportunity for the cannabis industry to actually transform potentially how regulation is actually done, and from a more data-driven perspective, which for us is very, very exciting, and it also brings a certain legitimacy to this industry that will, I believe, promote everything these gentlemen on the stage want to do and want to accomplish.
Jeff, can you give us just like one specific example? So if I'm a regulator in Colorado, which is one of your states, what am I able to do live, real time, right now if I pull up Metric?
Okay, so for example, and this has been done many times, that we don't do any press,
right?
And you can go look up these cases if you'd like. They're public record, but there have been many times since 2014 where Colorado especially has done a recall. So we're very familiar with that process because we were in perishable food for many years. We still are, and that is very painful for the federal government. It's very painful for the industry because they predominantly rely on harvesting data for a particular event or recall. So the cannabis industry or the regulatory community that uses a system such as ours has kind of changed that. The regulator doesn't need, when there's an event, there's something that happens and there needs to be a recall. With our system, with Metric, it's basically almost a push of button, and the industry is communicated immediately. Every product that is affected by that particular event, and also because the system is really a state manifest system, so that the state, for you to move product from one stakeholder to another, you've got to notify the state. Product cannot move once that hold or that recall has been initiated in the system. For example, at the federal level, if we had a recall or there was some product that was found tainted, now it's a real laborious process for the first 48 hours to try to make sure what's still in the supply chain. We don't want anybody else to be affected. That's a real stressful time. They don't have that in the states that are using a system such as ours. Once the product's affected, they can immediately know everywhere that product is in the supply chain, and they can decide to stop it until something else is either decided or they mitigate or remediate the problem.
So that's a pro. From your perspective, Ben and Mike, is this too onerous, or is this what helps us move into federal legalization eventually?
Well, we're huge fans of the technology, so that the term that he said, seed to sale, is a real common language. And maybe just to set the stage real fast, so everybody's on the same page, cultivation is the word where you grow the plants. Processing is where you take the plants from plant matter into oil and into branded products, value-added products. This is where the future is often. And then dispensaries, that's the retail, and it's on the distribution. And so services like Metric, or there's others, and I think Metric is the leader in the space, is tracking this on a seed-to-sale basis for the state to know where every plant is at all times, by SKU, by batch, what nutrients were it given, where is it, right?
Lab results.
Lab results, testing, which customers got it, the whole thing. Regulators are very scared. They're very afraid, and so they like to partner on things that give them comfort and help them in this brand new industry, this brand new scary place called cannabis. And we need to track everything all the time. And so we do inventory counts twice a day, which is very, heavily, but that's not from what he's doing, because that system makes our job easier. So we don't have to count them one by one. We're actually able to rely on a technology platform. So we applaud the regulators. We really like tightly regulated markets. That's advantageous for our investment, and that's advantageous for the industry. That keeps us all operating above board with high levels of integrity. And this is complex, and what he's doing, and we're moving hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of SKUs across to thousands and thousands of patients every day.
And we were talking earlier about technology infrastructures and whatnot, and it is fascinating to me that in some cases cannabis is the Wild West, and there are always there's still regulatory gaps between states and a lot happening. And in other places it is like an emerging market that has the benefit of if you come into a country that hasn't yet developed comm infrastructure and compute infrastructure, they go full wireless, they go to the newest technology. And in some ways we have this bifurcated market where it is Wild West, but in other cases literally the system we're talking about, where every step of the way, and we were talking about the alcohol industry earlier, it'd be as if every piece of wheat and oat that was turned into a drop of beer, and then that was put into a cocktail, and on, you would literally know. And from a business perspective, you talked earlier about, just let that sink in for a minute. Before you can ship that product, before you can even move it from your grow facility to where you press it for oil, you've got this system in place. So you really do have, back to some of the, by laying that infrastructure foundation right now that is top of the line and better than anything we have in food, better than anything I would say that we have in pharma, et cetera, it is creating opportunity. I'll be honest, I think it's definitely a big learning curve, is maybe one way to say it, as an operator, but it does create opportunities. Like I said, a lot of other technology pieces, a lot of other things that can ride on that infrastructure backbone that can solve basic business problems, because the regulators in these systems aren't there to solve basic business problems. They're there to protect the regulators and protect the industry. And so it's up to the businesses and technologists to use that infrastructure we're building and come up with things that speed up business and get it up to the top of the line.
Yeah, and I think what a lot of the technology layers are doing in between is helping to simplify this process. And Ben's right, there's a long way to go. But eventually, these tightly these tight regulations give opportunity for technology to really come in and make some of these tasks simpler. So I want to shift gears a little bit. Bharat is the CEO of PAX. Bharat, you've spent most of your career in the technology industry. Before PAX, you were in the smart home space and wearable technology. Talk to us about the other side of this space now when we're talking about consumer-facing technology, and maybe even tell a little background on PAX for those who may not know.
Yeah, it's a quick intro. Well, first of all, I want to thank you guys for coming after lunch. I know it's slow time and people are nodding off, and thank you, Lauren, over there and the Milken team for putting all this together. It's a lot of work. So for those who don't know PAX, we're the largest brand in the cannabis space. We're a consumer technology company in San Francisco that supports the cannabis space. We make these vaporizers. We make them for consumers. We're in many, many states. We've sold a few million of these. And I know we've described a lot of work, and there's regulatory stuff and tracking, but there's so few times, the thing you should get excited about, there's so few times, whether you're doing internet stuff, software, hardware, that 100, 200 million people, 1 billion people develop a habit like coffee, right? And it's something that builds over time. But it's such a large category where there's opportunities on the distribution side, on the growth side, building brand side, but also on the consumer technology side. So at PAX, we make these vaporizers, but a big part of our promise is trying to figure out, and this is the business I've been in for 15 years, which is when you connect a device or connect an offline experience, how does it become better? And a good example would be what happened when you went from Blockbuster to Netflix. Like, even Blockbuster was a big improvement because before that, and I'm dating myself here, but you'd go to a video store, there'd be a guy over there. There were no sections of movies. There were just a lot of movies and a lot of tapes, and you'd do like, what's good? And Blockbuster came, and they had like category management. You figure out you're an action section, you're the top 10 videos, and they cost a little bit more. And now you see that everywhere, at Walgreens, at Best Buy. And then Netflix came along and said, like, well, why should those be the only genres? Right? And you go into Netflix now and has all of these things that are figured out perfectly just for you. And I feel like that's one of the promises of technology. We're taking technology that's applied in other contexts, applying it to supply chain, but also on the consumer side, the cool part about it is trying to figure out what cannabis experience is perfect for people. It's a combination of hardware as well as software. It's stuff that people have done in smart home, whether that's folks like Nest or people like Fitbit in the wearable space, or in cannabis, it's PAX. We make really great hardware, and it comes with software, but the point of connecting the device to an app is to try and understand what works best for that person. And over time, when someone comes into that PAX ecosystem or comes into one of these consumer products, what makes it a good experience for them? Because there's no point people getting interested, coming to the space, having a bad experience, not knowing what they should take, how much of it. It's very scary. It's not like coffee. And there's some amount of stigma related to it. And so building the brand, building those technologies that are common in Silicon Valley, but they're not unique to the entire ecosystem is pretty interesting. But think about it, like 100, 200 billion people coming in across countries, across demos. It's a once in a lifetime thing. It just doesn't happen that often.
So, I mean, I guess what motivated, was that the primary motivation, sort of leave a more traditional technology career and shift into this space?
So that's a more personal question. No, so look, my dad was in the Navy. I went to school for public policy. I've always been interested in technology. Isn't either good nor evil, and and there are choices in every growing space around, what kind of experiences you build, what do you apply that technology for, and whether you're for cannabis or against cannabis, there's lots of really good fundamental questions people have, like, should my kids try this? What does this mean if, everyone's got a relative that's had cancer or touched by the opioid crisis or something else? There are all of these choices around what does it mean for me? How will people think of me in this space? And so coming back to me, I've always wanted that opportunity to work at a company, build a brand where even though the space is difficult, you try and figure out what the right thing to do is and navigate that over time. Because the space will grow no matter what, but you want one of those companies you can look back at, with the folks you work with, and they have families as well, and feel proud about what you did, right? And I think for folks that work in Silicon Valley, I know that's particularly important. I don't think that's unique, but I think for us that come from the technology space, building this institution that can apply technology the right way, I think is a pretty big. That's the reason I joined. I've spent 15 years in consumer tech. If you asked me a year ago, hey, do you want to work in the cannabis space? You know, I'd have to scratch my head. I'm pretty sure like Indian parents are like this. I don't know about all parents, but you know, lawyer, doctor, software engineer, cannabis entrepreneur was not like the fourth option. So it is different. But you hope the standard is high enough where you can make even them proud, right? I think that's true for everyone you work with.
So we talked a lot about compliance. We talked a lot about regulation. For your world, you actually don't, you know, as we had shown earlier, touch the plant.
We don't. It's a new phrase I'm learning. Touch the plant is a big thing in this industry.
Yeah. So you don't touch the plant.
Don't touch.
What are the advantages of that from a from a business perspective?
So there's a wide range of laws. So there's not just cannabis laws. There are paraphernalia laws. There are cross-state laws. There's aiding and abetting laws. There's a wide range of stuff. I think one advantage of not touching the plant and working with folks that do is they do a really great job on their side of complying with the law in terms of distribution, in terms of production, which we're not experts in. And we can deal with the device and software side of things, figuring out what systems we need to build and to deliver a good experience without the complexity of trying to figure out exactly what pods are filled with or exactly how you would navigate cross-state distribution. So it does make stuff easier in the sense that it feels a little like a traditional, albeit a little nuanced, consumer electronics business. And it's a good example of a business where you can get to scale. Our investors include Tiger, Fidelity, Tau Capital, the Pritzker family. But you can get to a much bigger, wider audience that's not just US, but international as well. To sell internationally much faster and build a brand well before like regulation, other stuff advances. Again, we comply with all state laws. I just want to put that out there. And I still think you have to comply with the spirit of the laws, even if you're not, you know, even if it's not written down. I still think you want regulators and the public perceiving you and actually us being a responsible company. So we take that pretty seriously.
Yeah. So it's interesting what PAX has been able to do without touching the plant to create a brand in the space, which is still part of the consumer experience. And so, you know, shifting into that side of things, whichever one of you would like to answer, how is the consumer experience shifting for so many of us in this audience? Whether you've used cannabis or not, stigmatically, you've only thought about it in certain ways historically. So now moving into a legal framework, legal environment, how are people consuming cannabis differently, and what do you expect the future to look like?
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah, we look at cannabis at Big Rock as a vegetable, and we grow it, in fact, next to kale and cucumbers. It's just the others are $4 a pound, and it's at least 700 to hopefully 1,800 if you do it right. And so we look at it from that perspective. And honestly, when you get into the science, and we've done a lot on the biotech side of it as well, but I think most people will come to the same conclusion that it's really a vegetable that has anti-inflammatory properties. So if you go back to what Popeye was, Popeye ate spinach because it was a public service announcement. At that time, people were starting to realize that almost every disease state you had was really malnutrition. Rickets is vitamin K deficiency, and iodine deficiency causes goiters, and pellagra was a niacin deficiency, and on and on and on. And I think what you'll find is that consumption of cannabis, not psychoactively, if you just walk in and eat it as a vegetable or take the oils out of it without preparing it, then what you have is a vegetable that has great anti-inflammatory properties. And so I think what you're going to find over time, and what's starting to happen, we've got a couple companies that focus specifically on the senior market, all non-psychoactive properties. So it's topicals, things for rheumatoid arthritis. It's THCA and sort of non-decarboxylated forms of the plant that are giving people pretty tremendous relief. So I think that right now, if you talk to the traditional stoner market, what people have been actually buying at the dispensaries, it's dabs and how do I get as high as possible really fast. But now, and that was really, in California alone, there were only 1 million people that had their card, their cannabis card, coming into this year. And I think in the whole country, country. It was only a few million. And so now in California, you can walk into a dispensary without a card. So it opens up the population dramatically. And as new states come online, it does there too. So now when you come in, it's no longer about how high can I get, et cetera. It's what can I get from grandma? What can I get from my mother? What can I get on and on for people who've been looking for alternative relief for a whole host of things. Not because it's a miracle drug, but because it's really great anti-inflammatory. If you had scurvy and you went and ate a lime, guess what? It had a pretty tremendous impact on your body. And if you have any of these diseases of inflammation and you start a cannabis regimen, I think you'll see some kind of decrease. So I think, you know, I look at my kid's cereal box in the morning and I'm blown away by all the additives. It's niacin and vitamin. Those aren't naturally in there. Those are things that we started adding to our cereal in order to raise the general population's health. And I think in about 20 years, you're going to look on the back of that cereal box and you're going to have about 10 cannabinoids that have been added into it for you. Non-psychoactive ones, but they'll be there.
It's going to be in the cereal aisle.
Yeah.
Ben, I mean, yeah, you're at the retail level. You have multiple retailers all over the country. What's changing? What do the trends look like?
So yeah, I mean, let's just set the stage here. $75 billion industry currently existing in the black market. Maybe it's 50, going to grow.
Yeah, more.
How's that going to change? Right? This is not the internet where, believe me, you'll buy your books online. Trust me. No. You're already doing it, and this is converting to regulated, branded. Okay. So experience in our store is the following. My husband and I have been drinking moonshine. It burns the back of his throat. And we say, well, don't you know that if you put rum and Coke together, it tastes good? And the rum is called Captain Morgan. And that's the change of experience. And you know what? You don't like drinking it? Well, you could rub it on your knee and you'll get the same effect, right? Or put a patch right here and you'll sleep through the night, no longer need Ambien. And so the data, in an overwhelming way, is starting to show this, right? You have a direct substitution effect, direct. 15% beer substitution effect into cannabis in mature markets. You have a direct substitution effect on opioids. Mm-hmm. This industry is at the crosshairs of the opioid epidemic. So you see 14% less Oxycontin prescriptions, 9% less fentanyl. That interaction, that consumer experience with cannabis is happening in our stores, right? And we see this as branded CPG with an opportunity to create a relationship, an authentic promise with the consumer based on that brand. And so let's just keep going for 1 second. The future liquor store, which is called a dispensary, think about those categories, think about those aisles for a minute. Hard liquor, beer, wine, mixed drinks, coolers, right? Those are all very distinct, well-branded, unique consumers, how they're marketed, use case, all of that stuff. Those future aisles of the dispensary are called edibles, tinctures, vapes, concentrates, flour. And that experience that the consumer is going to have is just going to be dramatically different. The days of buying weed in a baggie, that many of us did, and some will admit, is over. I mean, it's just done. Why would you drink moonshine? There is no industry of that anymore. And then as this thing moves step 2, you're going to stop buying the alcohol or the marijuana based on the THC content. Nobody buys booze based on what the proof. You don't say this Grey Goose, is that 80 proof or like 64 proof? No. How's that brand going to make me feel? What's that authentic promise? What am I doing? And so we can make promises with our fastest growing industry, which is senior citizens. So we can create a brand that makes a senior citizen authentic promise. They need help sleeping through the night. Huge seller. Opioids. Or an authentic promise with a group of women who like to go out and have book club and drink wine, except ours is no calories, no hangover. Mm-hmm. Well, that's pretty good.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. So that's a whole new experience for how to do it. It's not in a baggie, right? This is a vape pen. You can use this in a public place. It doesn't smell. Wow. So brand new, totally revolutionary spot, inflection point of the curve of innovation, and you're just going to see this thing take off, in my opinion.
And you're seeing it already, right? And I don't know where everyone is from or where you live. Obviously in California it's a little more visible. But at the end of last year, we saw Constellation Brands, $40 billion public company, invest $200 million into a Canadian cultivation. Historically, Constellation Brands has been pulling brands out of Canada. Why are you all of a sudden investing in this space? Because it's incredibly clear that there is a real recreational alternative here, and branded beverages is one element of it. And it'd be as if we talked about beverages just so broadly, right? How many subcategories are there? how many's touch different demographics, et cetera. It's incredible, and that's just one element. If you look at what's happening on the medical side, GW Pharma, public company out of the UK, their epilepsy drug is almost to market, and there's real evidence there as to what happens to people suffering with epilepsy and the dramatic decrease of attacks when using cannabis. So it's incredible to see, and I mentioned Canada in there. I want to talk about Canada very quickly, and then I do want to leave maybe even more than normal room for questions, because I know this is such an interesting topic, and I'm sure you guys have lots of questions, so keep those in mind. But let's talk about Canada for a second, Jeff. Fully regulated medical market, will be regulated recreational adult use market by the end of the summer. What are they doing right, and why are they so ahead of the game?
Well, they have the opportunity that the states don't have for national participation. One of the things that's been talked about the last few minutes is this idea of branding. There's also this concept of intellectual property protection. That is very, that's non-existent in the state governments. So I think Canada has an opportunity in those areas to move the intellectual property forward, move the industry forward from a regulatory standpoint. They also, the fully engaged federal participation will, I think, promote the areas that the states have to fill those gaps. I think also, I think it's very important, and the states struggle with this because they have to be so closed loop. I think Canada can begin to show the benefits of importing and exporting these products to countries. It's a huge opportunity for Jamaica, for example. I mean,
Israel, Germany.
In Israel, for example. So I think Canada could lead the way in all of those areas, and it's unfortunate that our federal government won't, wake up to the fact that Canada could very easily lead for a long time internationally this market.
Bharat, how do you look at Canada from a PAC's perspective?
I was just going to start with it. I look at it the same as the U.S., but that's bad for all the Canadians in the room. No. It's a very unique market because they've got some pretty unique elements. They have a national healthcare system, as most of you know, and so medical marijuana has a whole different scope there. It's not fragmented by state regulations. Right. It can be distributed through the national healthcare system. And so I think that's a pretty big angle in Canada. That's why you see a lot of medical cannabis companies coming up in Canada and aiming to distribute that. And then I think what's interesting about, I think the second thing that's interesting about Canada, and you've heard a few times building a brand, I would say as you guys think about investing, think about strong operators, how they build the brand. Brands are incredibly expensive to build and maintain and all that stuff. And so with Canada as an example, right, an ancillary product like us maybe has a slightly easier time because we're not filling it with a particular oil or a particular flower. But building a brand is a little easier for us than if you were doing any of those, because when you go to a Crown Corp, they have, these are the distribution points in Canada. They're government-controlled entities. And there's only so much branding you can do. Mm-hmm. Right? It's very, very limited. You get this little space, and since you can't advertise on TV or do any of the stuff you do in consumer electronics or any of the stuff people are used to build brands these days, then the question becomes, as an operator, how do you build that brand? And it might go back to doing more old-fashioned type of marketing, which is outside of dispensaries, outside of all of your normal vehicles like TV, where it's word of mouth, it's working with people on the ground. It's a lot of on-prem branding type of stuff that's very different from kind of what you're normally used to.
Yeah. So, at Casa Verde, we're invested in a number of companies, and as a young venture firm, we're thinking about exits and where do we exit and how do we exit and when are we going to exit. Canada has what's becoming a robust public market for cannabis companies. Mike, you and I were both in public equities for a long time. Talk to me about what you see going on there, and then Ben, I'd love to hear your opinion because I'm sure you're in the crosshairs of a lot of what's happening.
Oh, yeah, that's the, and back to what has Canada done right, and I think a big part of the Milken conference here is, and we heard Mike Milken speaking earlier on the video screen about access to capital. Quite frankly, that's what it is, and the same reason we're talking about ancillary products here because they're safer and easier to invest in than touch the plant products. It's also a heck of a lot safer to get money in Canada, and now there's a whole group of investment banks that are beginning to specialize in it, and you're starting to develop a real financial industry around bringing companies public. Now, it does pose some opposite problems. You definitely have large market caps for no revenue. You've got some names that have big market caps but sort of trade by appointment, as we used to say, when there's not a whole lot of volume going on. I think if you were to add up all the Canadian companies that are publicly traded now, you're only talking about maybe $25 billion worth of total market cap, which on one hand is great, but it's still smaller than, pick any Salesforce.com, I think is well over 40 right now. So on one hand, it's great that access is there. It's sad that we're losing. We're starting to see the U.S. open up, but it's sad that we're driving a lot of our companies. I mean, the whole country of Canada, I think, is equal in population to California. Yet some of our best California brands are already being courted every time we go meet somebody to look at an investment. They're on the Canadian public market path, and so there's a lot of people excited about that. But at the end of the day, it comes down to that access to capital, and I think if we don't change our policies over time, we'll lose that, and you'll have more and more of the financial expertise about how to do due diligence and take these companies public to spin up there. Back to on the brand building side, I think that's one just real quickly. If you think back to Mad Men, the show everybody watches, Don Draper. Don Draper was born in a dry country. Alcohol prohibition ended in 1933. We haven't even hit the 100-year anniversary of the beginning of alcohol prohibition in 20. So his whole career was built, and the whole show is about making alcohol and cigarette advertisements, and that was all sometime in the 50s. So we're at that, as we talk about brand building and whatnot, we're really right here at that forefront, and yet we're limited in how you can do that because you can't do all the TV ads, and we learned from the Don Drapers of the world. Anyway, I just think that's an interesting context to look at how are we going to develop brands with the history of the tobacco and alcohol brands that we've built before. But Canada is certainly the place that you can do it now with capital.
Ben, number of firms in the U.S., cannabis firms in the U.S. are now looking at Canada and accessing the public markets that way. Again, I think a massive blow for the U.S. indices and our markets here, but what is so attractive, and what do you think about this trend?
Right. So if you're studying cannabis, you got to be studying Canada. The simple analogy, the Bonnie and Clyde joke, why'd you rob the bank? Because that's where the money is. That's why we're going to Toronto a lot. So there's access to capital. Just set the stage to make sure we understand. Federally legal, sent through the Canada Post every day, through the mail to people. So there's banks, fine, no problem with banking. The investment banks, access to capital, animal spirits have kicked in. They're funding the space. So I started going there in 2016, studying stocks like an analyst, asking questions to CEOs. Industry went from $2 billion to about 15, 16 billion. Then Constellation and the Sands made a $200 million investment. Forward thinking, industry doubles. It's now about 25 billion. You're exactly right. We analyze that at like 2 to 3 times run rate revenue. Okay, and look at other CPG businesses, and you can kind of get your head around that. Look at the U.S. 350 million Americans, 75 billion. It's a $2 billion market, 0.02 times run rate revenue. Where is the opportunity? Where's the capital going? What's the unwind going to be? I mean, Barron's puts it on the cover. Okay? Now, look at the hamper up in Canada, the hampering that they have. They have access to capital, unlimited. The banks are in it. But they have a regulatory structure that's incredibly different, right? And no offense to any of the Canadians, borderline socialist, right? They're taking the profits in the distribution. They're taking the profits in a government-owned liquor store, the LBCO, and it depends on the province. And by the way, no brands. Oh, and by the way, no SKUs. 2 products. Mm-hmm. You can sell flour, and you can sell what they call oil that's actually called tincture. 2 SKUs. So, I mean, we've seen this movie before. We know where the brands are built. It's right down here. That's the land of the capital. This is the land of the brands. This whole thing is going to converge. And you're exactly right. So U.S. companies can list in Canada on an exchange called the CSE, the Canadian Stock Exchange, and trade and have access to capital. Oh, wow. Cost of capital plummets. What's going to happen? I mean, we've seen it. There's going to be scale, And the same thing in Canada, where there's a leadership group of 5 with the lowest cost who can go acquire M&A. That's the way this is going to go, because nobody in a $75 billion industry has 1%. Nobody.
Yep.
Nobody even has like 0.5% or maybe even 0.2%. I think there's less than $500 million companies. So what's going to happen is the Canadian markets, the banks are smart there. You're starting to see US banks, whether it's Cowen, Roth, Jefferies, put on investor days, they're packed. Right? People want to figure out how a $75 billion consumer packaged goods business that's already exists and non-branded is going to erupt. And all that's happening now is the Canadian banks raised their hand first because Trudeau was elected and he opened it up. And just the animal spirits are ripping. And so I think you'll see US companies list in Canada, get access to capital, and start to trade on what is real, not hype, and start to see different metrics. And the world of price discovery, the world of inefficiencies, you haven't seen the hedge funds come in at all. Right? You've seen nothing. I mean, the Tiger investment into an ancillary picks and shovels business is great, but touch the flower. I mean, definitely. That's where it's at. This is the $75 billion industry, and it's the top of the first, maybe.
So I have a question for Ben. What do you think about the import-export opportunity in Canada? I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
I mean, I guess I would say I guess I would say if you're a CEO with a company trading at that kind of thing and you have to go look for value to create for your investors, pressure is on, and you can't go to the land of the brands of 350 million people that's a $75 billion industry. You literally can't. You're not allowed. You have too much opportunity cost, you go to jail. Yeah. So you got to go to Germany and sign a contract, or Israel, or Colombia, or Venezuela. Yeah. And at the end of the day, do you think these guys are going to be importing cannabis from Canada for the rest of their lives?
Yeah, no way. Okay, we don't have too much time, so I want to open it up to questions. Sir? I don't know if you need a microphone for anything. I think it's on live, so they want to be able to hear your question. Here you go, right up front, yep.
So it sounds like you've just been talking about liquidity being a big issue. Obvious question is, how do you combine crypto and cannabis in a way that provides that liquidity, hopefully legally from the SEC's perspective here?
Double the regulation, with two of the most heavily.
I mean, I'll speak to us. We've seen a lot of deals in this space. Look, the biggest issue for us is we're not looking for circumvention, right? It has to be, the blockchain has tremendous opportunities to actually track in a similar way to what's happening with Metric and maybe automate it in ways we haven't seen before. Adding a currency level there to start banking some of these institutions could be huge. It's just we haven't seen anything yet that's doing it, in our opinion, in the most sort of thoughtful, legal way that's not going to, draw the regulators' attention. So I think there is opportunity. I just don't think anyone has sort of nailed it yet.
Solvable in the next 2 years?
Yes, it's definitely solvable within the next 2 years. Sure, I don't know.
Stephen Weiss, we run a company called PPGV, and we're invested in the sector. I was wondering if the group would address the issues of sharply declining price of the commodity. Obviously, Ben's already spoken about brand building and development of product and differentiation. I think the broader public is still at a very profound stage of ignorance. Someone recently asserted that the state of California has 7 years of production already cultivated here, and we still have no movement across borders to other states. There have been already ramifications of this in terms of the recent sale of Sunlight Supply to Scott's Miracle-Gro, concerns about that. So just wondering what that consolidation might mean and what the ramifications of declines in price would be.
So core to our thesis, from the lens I come into, is limited supply markets, limited licenses. So California has an unlimited, effectively. Colorado, there's 1,000 licenses for 5 million people. Take a state like Pennsylvania, 13 million people. There's only 12 people that can operate. We're one of them. Illinois, 13 million people, 20 people that can grow and process a product. We're 2 of them. Maryland, 6 million people, 15 people that can process. We're one of them. So it's very protected, more like a gaming license, and unlike free competition. And so I think the truth is is this perfect competition? Is this oligopolistic? And what's going to happen? is sort of the broad answer. Second is the price is going to come down. Right? You're going to see it in Canada. You're seeing these guys with unlimited access to capital drive down the cost. The marginal cost to produce a pound of marijuana is pretty cheap. But where on the value chain of the supply chain is the marginal, is the marginal profit, effectively? And so watch what happens to the price of the commodity versus the price of a 100 milligram chocolate bar.
Would you say it's like wine in that sense? Like, there's growers and there's a certain amount of capacity, but then you got to build brands on top of it?
Yeah. When the price of coffee crashes, does your triple venti iced mochaccino change price?
So, and I think you're right, and brands are going to lead the way, and that's how you're going to be able to capture margin. From our perspective, we focus as a fund specifically on the ancillary side, and we feel that that's one of the advantages there, is that you can protect some of that margin regardless of where the commodity goes.
And going back, I think what you'll see over time is this market will continue to bifurcate. You'll see regions like the Central Valley where you're allowed to grow 180,000 square feet versus other places where you can only grow 10,000 feet. I think you'll see that bifurcate and that cannabis be used for different uses. I think you'll see that spread out over time, and you'll be growing some cannabis just to make products that are for oils or tinctures, and then other that's more your craft piece. I mean, the price of a bottle of Jack Daniels hasn't changed that much. It's probably gone up over time, similar to the coffee piece. So I think you'll see that split up over time. We'll look at a map of California and the U.S. in the future, and it'll say, well, this is where you want to grow this kind of cannabis.
Next question? Someone in the back after too. Next one.
Hi, I've got a sort of a nerdy question. Investors used to be nervous about the income tax provision, Internal Revenue Code Section 280E. I don't know if they still are, and Ben, you got a lot of retail. How are you dealing with it? And as the big players come into the market, you see any movement to Congress to change it?
Yeah, I'm happy to start, and anybody can chime in. So still worried about it. Still a major factor. Just to set the stage, there's something called IRS Code 280E. Started in the Reagan war on drugs era, where it eliminated the drug dealer's ability to take deductions on their tax return. Translation for us, if you're trafficking in a Schedule I substance, the only deductions allowed are your cost of goods sold. And so in your question is, at the retail, many of your costs are SG&A. And the wholesale, most of your costs go into the cost of goods sold, all your labor and everything like that. On the retail, it's all SG&A, and so it's not as advantageous. So take our stores, which have very, very attractive unit economics, from $100 a foot to build and over $2,000 a square foot in sales, and very, very attractive same-store sales and protected oligopolistic markets. Spin out that, and what's that Wall Street going to do with that? But the reason we have that unbelievable business is there's no access to capital. And even when you get access to capital, the business isn't even a fair game, right? We're fighting a war with two hands behind our back, literally. So there's the free cash flow, so we manage the business incredibly carefully. I'm pretty maniacal on the numbers. So the business doesn't bleed cash, but if you monitor it like a real retail business of a free cash flow yield or anything normal, it's different. But it's in a position where we can invest in the business and scale it and get to scale and drive down costs and have a national chain. That's a very attractive asset. Combined with, I think also in your question, is there scale among operators of what's happening in DC? And look at the headlines. Okay, Schumer was here. You saw that. You saw what Trump did over the top on Sessions. There will be banking reform. That's effectively backdoor legalization. Like, we're not worried about the police locking us up. It's just hard to move money around because the banks are nervous because everybody's a CYA environment and nobody wants to be audited or thrown in jail for tax evasion. Okay? So you got to run this thing very above board, grab the mantle of integrity here and be a leader in the space because it's just a wide open world. But the tax code is disadvantageous to operators, but it doesn't tip over the business. And I believe we will see rapid change there over the next, X years.
I think that's why Karan said, like, circumvention is not the goal. It doesn't help, even if you can get away with it for a little bit. There's multiple ways in which regulatory authorities can come back at you if you're not complying with the spirit of the law that they're trying to do.
So, Ben, do you think that the success of the state level regulator can promote positive federal intervention in the whole process? In other words, we feel like that there's a big stake here for the state regulator to be successful from a federal perspective in in limiting diversion, in continuing to bring legitimacy,
For sure.
and operators like yourself that bring best practices, and that will also smooth out the price, supply chain and price
Yes.
and all that. So
The hurdle for us is unlike any other hurdle going on, and that's the opportunity here. So as we partner, we view ourselves as partnerships with you. We use Metric, we're a big client, or I guess through the state.
Right.
But we need credible players here in order to tip the tide here. The tipping point has happened, but the head cop in the country literally said he liked the Ku Klux Klan until he found out they smoked marijuana. Okay? So that's kind of the world we're in, which is totally insane. Full stop. So the idea that this product, which has never killed anybody, and Sanjay Gupta just told you on Sunday night, 140 Americans are dying every day from an opioid epidemic. Dying. Nobody has ever died from cannabis. Zero. And like, you know, don't confuse me with the facts, Mr. Attorney General, right? And so that's a problem for us. And so, of course, all the credibility we can bring here, the better. And it's only a matter of time. And you're starting to see whether it's Boehner, right? Who's now had a change of heart, and we applaud it, and it's great. This thing has tipped.
Yep. Governor Cuomo as well. You know, unfortunately, we're out of time. I know there's lots of questions. I'm sure some of us will be up here and or you know can meet outside to chat. So I want to thank the Milken Institute for supporting us, and thank you all for coming.